As a reader of Jane Austen, I tend to fall in this middle area between two schools of thought about her books. On one hand, you have uh, the fans, the ones who readers call themselves Janeites, typically. Um, but they tend to be fans of the romantic aspects of the book. They're heavily invested in the relationships. They adore the Regency period the books are set in, and basically they're primarily women readers who swoon over Colin Firth in a wet white shirt. On the other hand, there's the more scholarly approach to Jane Austen among literary scholars and historians who are more interested in the social aspects of the book. Jane Austen as a feminist, that she's really being sly and poking fun at those romantic conventions, um, taking that and spinning with it, looking into more of the depth of the book. Um, and often it's a more cynical interpretation of her books. I stand in the middle of those because I see both in her books. And so I was really pleased to come across recently Lucy Worsley's biography of Jane Austen. And she addresses what she sees as Austen's double voice in her books. So, what that means is Jane Austen will say something and then she'll undercut what she just said. So there's almost an ambivalence to some of her writing. And this is true also of the romantic aspects. Toward the end of Pride and Prejudice, for example, when Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy are getting together, there's still a ton of embarrassment on Elizabeth's part. Her family is embarrassing to her. Her reaction, her prejudices against Mr. Darcy are now embarrassing in light of them finally getting together. And there's a line there that talks about all this stuff actually mars the courtship period. Jane Austen herself chose not to marry. She had numerous opportunities to get married. She was even engaged for a brief time, I think maybe a day. It was a really short engagement. Chose not to. So she may have had her own mixed feelings about relationships and marriage that may have come out in her fiction. It's tough to read autobiographically. But this double voicing that Lucy Worsley points out, it's not just in her novels, it's in her letters as well. She'll say something and then undercut it. And so you don't know, was she serious? Was she joking? So suffice it to say, there's a lot to unpack in her books. They're not just romances. So as I was rereading Jane Austen recently, I was reading my two favorites after many years of having not read them. Of course, Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion, which is my other one. I started thinking about some of these issues of who are Jane Austen's readers and why do we read her? And so that is what is inspiring this video today. I'm not going to go too deep into the novels themselves because they're so well known. At the time that Jane Austen was writing, so late 18th century and then into the early 19th century, novels were not very respectable. Their reputation really wasn't that good. And in fact, Jane Austen addresses this in her posthumously published novel, Northanger Abbey, which is a satire on the Gothic novel. She takes time out in one chapter to actually mount a defense of the novel because it wasn't considered very respectable to be a reader of novels, especially if you were a woman, because there could be a lot of content in it that could be considered objectionable. Even if not very explicit, just references to sex, to extramarital relationships, to bad guys, loss of virtue in a woman, which, as Mary Bennet reminds us, is no less brittle than it is beautiful. So typically, if women were writing novels in this period, they were doing so under the name Anonymous, which Jane Austen did. Started off doing. Her identity became known during her own lifetime. It's tough to keep these things secret, especially after her success with Pride and Prejudice. I've come across some other women in the 19th century primarily who are having to ask their father's permission to read novels. There's a letter from the early American feminist writer Margaret Fuller. She's about maybe 9 or 10 years old, begging her father to let her read a novel while he's away on business, saying, "Oh, but it's such a wholesome book, father." Don't know if she was allowed to ultimately read that novel. I think Virginia Woolf, too, who was young in the late 19th century, I'm not really sure that she was allowed to read novels. Her father mostly gave her history to read. So, Pride and Prejudice was Jane Austen's first real big success. It was only the second novel she published. Her first was Sense and Sensibility. And Pride and Prejudice was so innovative. It was actually very ahead of its time in its portrayal of a woman with a rounded character. She wasn't just one thing. The character of Elizabeth Bennet has virtues, she has flaws, she tends to speak her mind, which is unusual for back then, and express her feelings. In fact, even one reviewer at the time Pride and Prejudice was published in January of 1813 said, "This Elizabeth Bennet character is so impertinent. This is not a good role model for girls." Because before that time, women characters tended to be one-dimensional. They were either, very, very virtuous or very, very unvirtuous. There was no real in between. This was especially true of things like one of the most popular novels of the day was Samuel Richardson's Pamela. Jane Austen knew this book very well. She read it multiple times. The subtitle of Pamela is called "Or Virtue Rewarded." So Pamela is this super virtuous woman who is pursued by her male employer, who tries to do everything in his power to seduce her, get her to shuck off her virtue. And Pamela resists at every turn, no matter what the pressure, till finally the employer says, "All right, I give up, I'll marry you." So Pamela's virtue is rewarded with marriage. This novel was very popular, but it was also considered so ridiculous in terms of the characterization that another novelist, Joseph Fielding, wrote a parody of Pamela called Shamala. And so goody two-shoe type characters were very, very popular. In fact, the novel Goody Two-Shoes, which was designed for children, was also something Jane Austen knew very well. She had a copy. And you can see this sort of in her first novel, Sense and Sensibility, which is not as popular with modern readers, because the whole point of that book is that logic and keeping your emotions to yourself is a far better virtue than feelings and letting them be known by other people. And ultimately, the sensible heroine, Eleanor, is rewarded with marriage to the man she loves, and the character full of the sensibility, the emotions, Marianne, is punished by losing the man she loves and having to marry someone she doesn't really care about. So for Jane Austen to turn around and then write Pride and Prejudice is a pretty major deal. I mean, and when thinking about how innovative Pride and Prejudice is in terms of its more realistic portrayal of people and the psychology of the characters and their interactions, I mean, we only have to look at another book by another woman published around the same time, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was actually published 5 years after Pride and Prejudice, so 1818, but it feels like it belongs more to the 18th century. It does, in fact, take place in the 18th century. Mary Shelley makes this clear with the dates of letters. It's an epistolary novel, so it's told via letters, and then also has a nested narrative, which is a very 18th century device. But the characters in Frankenstein, we don't really think about it maybe so much because the story has such cultural resonance. But the characters are not really, they don't feel like real people. They feel like types. You have, the scientist making a Faustian bargain because he wants to, trespass on God's creation and gain knowledge for himself. You know, the virtuous woman that the doctor is in love with. And even though Mary Shelley imbues Frankenstein's creature with humanity, they still feel like types. So by the time Jane Austen was publishing and Mary Shelley was publishing, the epistolary style of the novel had fallen out of fashion. In fact, when Jane Austen wrote Sense and Sensibility, she wrote it in the late 18th century. It was an epistolary novel of letters between the two sisters. It sat in a drawer for many years along with the first draft of Pride and Prejudice, but when she dug Sense and Sensibility out to have a chance of being published, she realized she had to completely restructure the novel because the epistolary style was no longer in vogue. So she changed it to this more straightforward third person narration. So so Jane Austen was in fact keeping up with the times in terms of style. So but in this way we can appreciate even more that she was keeping abreast of trends in novels and forging her own path, prefiguring the psychological realism of the Victorian period that would, of course, carry over into the 20th century. I don't have exact proof of this, but my suspicion, just knowing this time period a little bit and looking at who's doing most of the writing, who's doing most of the book buying, my sense is that Jane Austen wasn't writing specifically for women. Novels were for everyone, although, of course, there were some fathers and maybe even some husbands, I don't know, who said no women reading these books. But when we think about it, books in these days were expensive. So who was buying the books in this time period? It was men. Who were publishing books in this time period? Men. Who were reviewing books in this time period? Men. Were probably the main buyers of novels as well. And in fact, we can see this sort of who's doing the book buying thing in Jane Austen's novels. In Pride and Prejudice, her Elizabeth's father, Mr. Bennet, often retreats to his library to get away from his nagging wife and his silly daughters. So he's basically just shut up in his library all day reading. So he has a fairly substantial book collection. And Mr. Bingley, the nouveau riche neighbor who has this magnificent estate, is also working to try to build up a library because that's something you do to signify your status as landed gentry. So the book buying, the book reading, the book publishing, the book reviewing, this is all the domain of men, typically. And when Pride and Prejudice was published anonymously in January 1813, it was reviewed mostly favorably. It was a huge hit, this book. But one reviewer, a man, of course, said, there's no way that this anonymous author is a woman because this book is too clever. So obviously this is a very sexist statement, but it also sort of acts as a hostile witness to my point here that there was not necessarily a presumption that this book was written by or for women, that maybe a man could have written this, because there was no real distinction between men's books and women's books. There were just books. To this point, Jane Austen had a lot of really high-profile male fans and readers at the time she was publishing. One of her biggest ones was the Prince of Wales himself. The prince who lent his name to the Georgian period, the Regency period, that guy. He loved Pride and Prejudice, and in fact, he got his royal librarian to get a hold of Jane Austen with further plot suggestions for future books. And in fact, she dedicated Persuasion to him. I don't think she was that thrilled that he was a fan of hers because she disapproved of his louche ways, his decadent court. But in the later Victorian era, she had another high-profile male fan, the poet laureate of England, Alfred Lord Tennyson, when he was touring around the town of Lyme Regis, where she set some of the action of her novel Persuasion. His tour guide was blathering on about something historical he didn't care about, and he interrupts his tour guide and he says, "Never mind all that. Show me the place where Louisa Musgrove fell." So in Persuasion, the character Louisa falls off a wall in Lyme Regis, and he wanted to see that spot because he was such a huge fan. So Jane Austen had a bunch of male readers in the early and into the late 19th century. This makes me think that this separation into men's books and women's books, particularly in the arena of novels, is a much more modern construct. So, concerning this modern construct of men's novels and women's novels, I'm not really sure when this began. I would have to research it a little more. Well, I've worked around books for many years. I've worked in libraries, I've worked in bookstores. I cannot tell you how many conversations and remarks I have overheard men making of a derogatory nature towards books written by women. I've also, spoken to many well-read men who will not read books by women. They could be the most progressive, forward-thinking guys, wouldn't say a sexist word against a woman, if they were held at gunpoint, but they won't read books by women. And I've never been given a satisfactory answer as to why this is, although I suspect that this is because they don't want to deal with what they're assuming is going to be emotions. In fact, I kid you not, I literally came across this attitude just 2 days ago when I was waiting around in my doctor's waiting room. I overheard this guy talking to another guy about the book he was reading. And he said, I picked this up and I was a bit scared of it because it's a chick book. I quote verbatim, a chick book. But you know what? I actually like it. And I couldn't resist. I said, imagine that. So yeah, I come across this all the time. And it's very strange to me because women are in the habit of reading male authors and female authors and seeing really no problems with reading male authors unless you're upset, that say you're in a class of 19th or 20th century fiction, like there are no women on this list. So in some instances, yeah, women object to reading only men, but at the same time, we don't really have a problem. We've been kind of trained as readers to just put our perspective into that of the protagonist, whether they're male or female. But for some reason, guys have, as readers, have not been trained to do that with the opposite sex. And it reminds me a little bit too of, this is going off on a bit of a tangent, but it's rooted back into this issue still. Another 19th century book that I love a lot, which is Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. When Louisa May Alcott was publishing this book, geared toward children, I don't believe that children's literature was separated out either. A children's book was a children's book. There wasn't really anything geared specifically toward boys and geared specifically toward girls. So that meant boys were reading Little Women. And I came across something recently that was talking about favorite books of men in the late 1800s in up to the years of World War I. These were the favorite books of Ivy League educated guys. Guess what book was at the top of that list? Little Women. And Little Women actually was innovative too, because Louisa May Alcott, she hated the thought of writing for children. She called it, she didn't want to write what she called moral pap for the young. She much preferred writing what she called her blood and thunder tales. She wrote a lot of these sensational sort of horror stories about sex and drugs and femme fatales who are bilking men out of their money. I mean, yeah, that was what she preferred to write. But then she struck upon this idea of basing a story on her childhood and that of her sisters, and that became the March family of Little Women, very realistic characters. Before that, children's literature, these books were meant to be didactic. They were supposed to teach children how to behave and the consequences of if you didn't behave. So Louise May Alcott shed most of that. There's still a little bit of that because she had to cater to that convention. But for the most part, these characters have good points and they have bad points, and they fight and they make mistakes, and sometimes they die, and sometimes they don't end up with the person you think they're going to end up with. And it's real. It's real. I've also seen a few cases of English teachers in middle schools and high schools trying to include books like Pride and Prejudice and Little Women in their curriculum. The boy students tend to put up a fight for having to read these chick books. But what the teachers have found is that most of the boys end up liking Pride and Prejudice and Little Women. Why? Because they're extremely well-written books that deal with universal themes of love, family, friendships, money, the search for a home, your dreams. I don't know, I think we've just kind of socialized guys into being squeamish about having to read or see anything to do with love, which is so strange to me. Do they not experience love? Is that not a universal human emotion? Pretty much every single song written by a male musician is about love. Shakespeare, we have so many male authors who are writing about this too. That's acceptable for some reason, but this isn't. So we have a weird problem, I think, with readers. A sort of blind spot and a double standard. And I would actually go out on a limb and make this statement that in this case of guys not wanting to read books by or about women, we are actually more sexist now than we were in the 19th century. What? Yeah, progress isn't linear, obviously. The reason these teachers in middle school and high school are introducing these books into their classroom, despite the vehement objections, is because they know that reading fosters empathy. And they want to socialize more boys into empathizing with girls. Girls are taught to be empathetic pretty much from day one. And they can sort of code switch, right, between books. And at the same time, that you want to engender empathy and have us read books that are about a wide variety of people who are different from us. At the same time, why do we always have to 100% identify with the protagonist of a book? It was Vladimir Nabokov who wrote that if we only read to identify with the main character of a book, then we're immature readers. I mean, who can argue with that, really? So I'm going to close with some statements by another really fantastic novelist that everyone should read, Virginia Woolf, who was a huge Jane Austen fan, and I think had some of the greatest insights into what makes Jane Austen such a brilliant novelist. She says this in an essay she wrote about Jane Austen, which was published in The Common Reader, her famous collection of essays. So Virginia Woolf says, she, Jane Austen, wishes neither to reform nor to annihilate. She is silent, and that is terrific indeed. One after another she creates her fools, her prigs, her worldlings, her Mr. Collinses, her Sir Walter Elliots, her Mrs. Bennets. She encircles them with the lash of a whip-like phrase, which, as it runs round them, cuts out their silhouettes forever. Delight strangely mingles with our amusement. Beauty illumines these fools. Never did any novelist make more use of an impeccable sense of human values. It is against the disc of an unerring heart, an unfailing good taste, and almost stern morality, and she shows up those deviations from kindness, truth, and sincerity, which are among the most delightful things in English literature. And she goes on to say, basically to speculate what would have happened if Jane Austen had not died young. She died, I think, at the age of 42 from an illness. What effect would all of this have had upon the 6 novels that Jane Austen did not write, as opposed to the 6 she did? She would not have written of crime, of passion, or of adventure. She would not have been rushed by the importunity of publishers or the flattery of friends into slovenliness or insincerity, but she would have known more. Her sense of security would have been shaken. Her comedy would have suffered. She would have trusted less to dialogue and more to reflection to give us knowledge of her characters. Those marvelous little speeches which sum up in a few minutes' chatter all that we need to know in order to know an Admiral Croft or a Mrs. Musgrove forever. That shorthand hit or miss method, which contains chapters of analysis and psychology, would have become too crude to hold all that she now perceived of the complexity of human nature. She would have devised a method, clear and composed as ever, but deeper and more suggestive. Her satire, while it played less incessantly, would have been more stringent and severe. She would have been the forerunner of Henry James and of Proust. But enough. Vain are these speculations. The most perfect artist among women, the writer whose books are immortal, died just as she was beginning to feel confidence in her own success. So in a way, Virginia Woolf is saying she wrote 6 of the most perfect books ever written. We don't know what would have happened if she had lived longer, but very likely she would be considered as big a deal in terms of psychological realism as Henry James and Marcel Proust, who are the 2 biggies, I think, of that genre in late 1800s into the early 20th century. It is a shame that Jane Austen has fallen under this chick lit category. Her books are better than that category would suggest. They shouldn't be categorized really as anything except as the work of a genius writing in the English language.